City Kitchen will turn the city inside out, extracting the home from within its routinized context by sowing a series of anti-typological kitchens across idle sites in San Francisco. The city will be transformed to seed experimentation and invite new, unpredictable modes of cooking, dining, and social interaction. The investigation into misuse begins at home, where our family home and its rooms lack a fixed purpose. Despite designated terms and furniture for each space, a living room can become a dining room or bedroom, whilst the terrace can become the kitchen. We are using a hybridity of type that is neither British nor Iraqi. We have found a way to reappropriate the kitchen setting and translate it into many different programmatic zones across the home. Similarly, the traditional Iraqi home is important to the project, as these homes in Baghdad are planned around a central open courtyard, an idle space void of fixed program, where the inhabitants can extract objects from the periphery and use them as seeds within the courtyard as new scenarios begin to unfold. The isolated kitchen is located towards the back of the home and is divided by a series of walls that work towards concealing any exposed symbols of kitchen labor, whereas the courtyard enables the women to invent new architecture for cooking and dining as they begin to transform the courtyard into a space unlike the routinized isolated kitchen and into a laboratory for collective cooking. The next example transports the traditions of the Iraqi house and plants them within a typical British home. The courtyard vanishes, instead transformed into a typical garden, making idle space a productive landscape. The occupants bring internal furniture into the garden, and makeshift cooking spaces are created within the underutilized portions of the garden. Whilst the internal kitchen incurs prescribed forms of use, the new experimental kitchen allows the women to break free of a normalized approach to isolated kitchen labor. The next example is a small exam town located in Maotengcheng, China, where children undertake full-time exams and the parents once again become their primary carers. Mothers move into apartment complexes with idle courtyards, and they transform the space into large laboratories that enables collective cooking and the division of labor. This is important to my project, as these mothers begin to appropriate these underutilized spaces and invent new architecture for cooking by turning their homes inside out and pulling objects and furniture into the void. The project is located in San Francisco, where the outdoor culture of the city aligns with the picnic culture and desirable climate. And these case studies are important to my process of identifying these idle sites across the San Francisco Strip. These sites are not being used, and many of them are on display and visited infrequently by the residents of the city. Underutilized sites and buildings throughout the city have been appropriated to house isolated kitchen units known as dark kitchens. These enable us to delegate our cooking needs to restaurants, renting individual units and forsaking dining, instead allowing their customers to choose their own locations. They reappropriate the abandoned buildings and underutilized urban spaces, such as car parks, where they can adapt the kitchen to function within a trailer. Meanwhile, our kitchens at home are designed as a factory for one and focus primarily on the efficiency of the housewife, enabling her to work in isolation with her behavior dictated by the organization of space, by normalizing routines and use within the kitchen. The design of new spaces across the strip will create anti-typological kitchens that are neither factory kitchens for one nor efficient industrial production machines, endlessly providing for us when we no longer have the time to cook for ourselves. Instead, they open themselves up to experimentation through new space making. I have extracted a series of themes and conditions that will enable the design and implementation of new kitchens for the city. Implanted within 3 specific sites, the beach, the hillside, and the garden. Each seed will respond to its imposed conditions, including decontextualized, impermanence, and unfamiliar. The first site is the beach. The typical and familiar kitchens that we have become accustomed to respond to the metric configurations pertaining to a standard contextualized kitchen. The decontextualized factory kitchens reinforce the normative behavior that resides within the domestic realm, whilst the new kitchens utilize raised platforms as seeding framework for visitors to begin attaching their own program upon. Each installation utilizes non-directional kitchens and enclosures that enable the flexibility of collaboration whilst appearing seemingly typical for those unfamiliar with the decontextualized. A series of anti-Neufert kitchens are installed across the beach. Whilst the design of these spaces are anti-gendered and anti-typological, they are designed as highly efficient laboratories that can serve the needs of the individual and the collaborative. The kitchens have been designed to become reactive to the needs of the users. Use of space, the levels of intimacy, and the enclosure itself can begin to realign itself to appeal to their needs throughout the day. Movement across boundaries begin to blur the distinction between labor and leisure. The kitchen opens itself up to experimentation and the differing scales that cooking can incur. The home is turned inside out, the enclosure drawn back as people begin designing their own program by placing their own furniture and appropriating the voids around the kitchens. My next site, Bernal Heights, is one of the few remaining pastoral sites in San Francisco. A range of primary, secondary, and tertiary trails have been erected over the years. I am working with the desire paths that have emerged across the span of the hill. These informal paths trespass across the primary routes, creating multiple thresholds and blurring the boundaries between the inside and out. The new snaking structure and field seeds the unpredictability of new experiments conducted by the people who reside within the city or nearby. Beyond the enclosure, an indicative grid of utility posts are arrayed across the hillside. These points enable further opportunities for misuse, as guests plug in to extend the domestic within the unruly. Winding around these new desire lines, the ground and roof houses a series of kitchen seeds to enable people to begin using it almost like their own house, treating the trails and its surrounding context perhaps as a yard, living room, kitchen, or bedroom. Domestic elements are dispersed along the trail. However, they have been manipulated until their resemblance to their implied Neufert counterpart is completely unfamiliar. The people of the city begin to invert their homes, bringing with them pieces of furniture and creating new scenarios by cooking up new use of space, furniture, and architecture. The hillside house uproots and extracts guests from their familiar association of the house. Where two paths converge, they create a series of new courtyards. Intimacy is malleable, and as visitors move across the path, walls and enclosures melt away to reveal idle trails awaiting reappropriation. The inhabitants bring objects and furniture with themselves as they begin inhabiting the idle landscape. The kitchens seed a new framework for inhabitation. Unlike the home, the trail incurs constant motion without subdivisions. Instead, the ground treatment begins identifying these spaces, differentiating between what is internal or external. Life and inhabitation bleeds through these boundaries as the inhabitants continually add to the landscape, building new scenarios and plugging into the site to enact familiar domestic activities, turning the city inside out and the hillside house into a laboratory where experimentation is sown. The final site is a neighborhood block and its gardens. The houses form a perimeter around subdivided private residential gardens. A series of new kitchen enclosures and walkways form new courtyards. Void of fixed furniture and program, the enclosure can begin to unfold and the kitchen drawn into the void. The boundaries between public and private spaces are demarcated, but can be blurred as neighbors move between these spaces. The public and private gardens alongside these new enclosures can incur new modes of cooking and dining, allowing neighbors to work collaboratively and dine in celebration. An extension of the domestic realm, each neighbor can begin bringing furniture with them into these new spaces. The voids can be constantly reinvented, a laboratory whereby collective production could occur, cooking multiple scenarios where intimacy is malleable and activities reflective of the individual need and not dictated by the design itself. With the kitchen extracted and uprooted from its enclosed domestic setting, residents of the city can now begin manipulating the idle space within their homes. The old kitchen becomes a bare canvas for their owners to begin dictating their own implied use of space. When left idle, many of these sites serve aesthetic purposes, are used infrequently, and do not necessarily permit an extended stay. The beach enabled us to escape, a break away from our lives, but perhaps only on the weekends, and really just to sit and sunbathe. But now we can bring our domestic furniture with us, and arrange the space as an extension of our home. The kitchen is raised upon a sturdier ground, and domestic life unfurls around it. Sand trespasses across the platform, and boundaries between kitchen and non-kitchen spaces blurred, labor and leisure transcending beyond sight and space. Raising us above the daily demands of life that prevail below, the hillside incurred constant motion, from one point to another, jogging or walking, alone or together, whilst the hillside house enabled us to deflect from the path and our routines. Acting as an extension of our home, the hillside and its landscape becomes our yard, kitchen, or bedroom. Residents can build upon what exists, designing their own use of space by dividing new enclosures. The ground and structure seize the possibility of building new furniture, growing more food, and prescribing new functions to space. Before, gardens were aesthetic devices, used infrequently and perhaps mostly by children, with many not even having access to their own garden. Now, each block is transformed into a giant house that transcends beyond the routines of internal and external spaces. The kitchens, gardens, platforms, and courtyards enable multiplicity. Stepped floors become tables and chairs, allotments can begin to feed the kitchens, and residents extend domesticity beyond party walls. The reappropriation of idle space can then make its way into our homes. The kitchen's extraction reveals a void where residents can design and implement new forms of use within. These kitchens seed unimaginable scenarios by revealing themselves to the multiplicity of scale and use. In doing so, these anti-typological kitchens invent new forms of cooking, dining, and interaction, revealing the potential of the void through the extraction and seeding of new kitchens. Thank you.